Tonight, we're stepping into a job that was somehow lonelier than a prison cell, more awkward than a dinner party with your ex, and filled with more quiet desperation than a Jane Austen novel. The Victorian governess, a lady by birth, a servant by status, living in a rich estate, but eating cold meals alone in the nursery. She couldn't be friends with the family, she was staff. She couldn't be friends with the staff, she was too genteel. She educated the daughters, but could never attend their weddings. She was the most uncomfortable person in any wealthy household. But here is the thing, that strange limbo existence turned governesses into some of the most powerful writers of the Victorian age. Jane Eyre, the Brontes, born from that cold silence. Let me paint you a picture. England, 1851. You are a well-bred young woman, educated in French, piano, and watercolors. But your father has died and the money is gone. Your choices are needlework in a damp attic, scrubbing floors in someone else's kitchen, or the governess route. You take the governess route, and within a week you discover you have stepped into a social nowhere. You eat cold suppers alone in the schoolroom while the family dines beneath you. The servants resent you for giving yourself airs. The family suspects you of trying to rise above your station. You are in the census, one of 25,000 women exactly like you, 2% of all unmarried women between 20 and 40, drifting through other people's hallways, never quite belonging anywhere. Your salary is pitiful. Charlotte Bronte earned £20 a year, with £4 deducted for laundry. There is no pension, no sick pay, no path upward. If a jealous mistress decides you have grown too close to the children, or that your youth threatens her marriage, you are dismissed on the spot with no reference. It is a life of immaculate posture and silent desperation. And yet, out of this frozen limbo, something was about to ignite. The governess, alone with her thoughts in 1,000 silent nurseries, would pick up a pen. The Bronte sisters, Jane Eyre, the entire governess as heroine tradition, all forged in that same quiet torture. So, how did a woman who wasn't even allowed to enter the drawing room become the most powerful literary voice of the century? And what was it really like, hour by hour, to inhabit that strange, invisible role? That is where we go next. Congratulations, you have just been hired as a governess. You are standing in the gravel driveway of a country house with 3 floors of windows staring down at you, clutching a single carpet bag. The housekeeper, who already resents you because you are neither servant nor family, shows you to the schoolroom, which will also be your bedroom, your dining room, and your prison. The room is cold, the grate is mean, and someone has shoved a folding bed behind a screen in the corner. The children will arrive at 7 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning. Tonight you will eat cold mutton alone, and no one, not the master, not the mistress, not the footman, will speak to you beyond what is absolutely necessary. This is the governess's first lesson. You are invisible now. The Victorian governess was the most exquisitely uncomfortable invention of the British class system. She lived in a state of permanent social suspension, dangling between the world she came from and the world she served. The family upstairs would not befriend her because she was hired help. The servants downstairs would not befriend her because she was too well-spoken, too educated, too nearly a lady. She ate in the schoolroom because she could not be seated with the family. That would break rank. But she could not eat in the servants' hall either. The cook would be offended. So she sat on a hard chair, next to the wooden globe and the spelling primer, chewing in silence while the real life of the house thrummed below. One governess of the period recalled that she was given her meals on the same tray, used to feed the dogs. The numbers alone tell you this was not a niche problem. In the census of 1851, exactly 25,000 women described themselves as governesses. That is 2% of every unmarried woman between the ages of 20 and 40 in England. But the real number was probably much higher, because many women reported themselves with euphemisms: teacher in a private family, companion, or simply no occupation, to avoid the stigma. Being a governess was, in the bluntest terms, a fall. It meant your family had money once and does not anymore, or that your father died before securing a dowry, or that you are the third daughter of a clergyman with nothing but a genteel accent and a complete set of Jane Austen novels. The only respectable alternatives were worse. Needlework paid pennies. A milliner's shop was one whisper away from ruin, and the workhouse was the end of everything. So the governess route it was, a social lifeboat that leaked from the moment it hit water. Now, let's talk about money, because the economics of governess life were as brutal as the loneliness. Charlotte Brontë, and yes, that Charlotte Brontë, worked as a governess in 1839 for a family called the Sidwicks. Her salary was £20 per year, minus a £4 deduction for washing. That left her with £16, which in today's terms is about £1,500 a year, less than the cost of renting a single room. And Charlotte Brontë was not an outlier. Typical governess wages ranged from £20 to £80 per annum. The very luckiest, hired by a duke or an earl with a guilty conscience, might touch £100. But here is the cruel arithmetic. A governess had to dress respectably on these wages, buy her own soap and candles, contribute to the cost of her washing, and still send money home if she had dependent siblings. By the time she had paid for a pair of boots and a new collar, there was nothing left for saving. No pension, no sick fund, no rainy day. When she reached middle age, if she reached middle age and was too worn down to teach, she faced the poorhouse or the charity of relatives who had long since grown tired of her. The governess's benevolent institution, which we will get to, was founded precisely because the streets of London were beginning to fill with destitute, elderly gentlewomen who had spent their youth in other people's nurseries. But before the destitution, there was the daily grind, and the grind was designed to remind you that you mattered to no one. You woke before the children, often in the dark, because the nursery fire was lit by a maid who would not acknowledge you as a person. You dressed in a plain dress, gray, brown, black, because the conduct manuals of the era warned governesses that any hint of vanity would be seen as a threat. A pretty governess was a problem. A young governess was a crisis. The mistress of the house, perhaps 20 years older than you and exhausted from childbirth, would watch you like a hawk. Were you speaking too warmly to the master at the dinner table? Not that you were at the dinner table, you were in the nursery, but even a passing exchange in the hallway could be reported. An 1847 guide for governesses called The Governess, or The Little Female Academy, advised that the governess must on all occasions appear indifferent to admiration and wear no ornament that may attract attention. So you became a gray wrapper, a walking piece of furniture, and you learned to walk softly. Your charges, the children, were your only companions, and even they were not fully yours. The little boy was taken from you at 7 or 8 and sent to school. The girls stayed longer, but you were required to keep an emotional distance. When the daughters grew up and were presented and married, you were not invited to the wedding. You had taught them their letters, their French, their piano scales, their moral lessons, and you were about as relevant to their future as the old spelling primer. One former governess wrote that when she accidentally met her former pupil years later in the street, the young woman, now married and a lady, walked past as if she had never seen her. The instruction had been internalized. The governess was a tool, not a friend. So you poured your days into the curriculum. The 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, for the young ones. Then the accomplishments for the older girls, French, Italian, watercolor painting, the pianoforte, singing, a little history, a little geography, and the use of the globes. You were expected to produce a finished young lady who could catch a husband, but you had none of the authority of a schoolmaster. If the child was lazy, you could not punish severely because the mother might object. If the child was spoiled, you absorbed the tantrums. You were a conduit for parental ambition with none of the parental love. And at the end of each day, when the last lamp was blown out and the children had been handed over to the nurse, you sat alone in your cold room, and you listened to the carriage wheels on the drive and the distant laughter from the drawing room where real life was happening. You were 18, 25, 32 years old, and you might do this every day for the rest of your life. And here is the detail that sticks in the throat. You were not supposed to have visitors. Many employers forbade it entirely. A governess's friend or relative, if they dared to call, was often left standing in the hall or made to wait in a cold back room. The housekeeper would be rude. The family would refuse to meet them. So you were not only isolated from the house, you were cut off from the world outside. The only mail you received was opened by the mistress. The only books you could read had to pass inspection. Novels were considered dangerous, too exciting, liable to give you ideas. So many women did what they always do in prison. They started writing in secret. This is the unexpected pivot of the governess story. The very conditions that were meant to crush these women, solitude, intellectual frustration, endless silent hours after the children were in bed, turned them into writers. The governess had an education, a pen, a cheap candle, and a torrent of unfiltered observation of upper-class family life. She saw the parents as they really were, the father's temper, the mother's jealousy, the cruelty beneath the polished mahogany. She was invisible, and invisible people are the best witnesses. The Bronte sisters are only the most famous example. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Bronte all served as governesses. All three hated it with a fury so hot it could have melted a fireplace fender. Charlotte described her employer, Mrs. Sidgwick, as caring nothing for her children and everything for her comfort. Emily lasted about 6 months before the homesickness and the humiliation destroyed her health. Anne wrote of her charges with a mixture of tenderness and despair. But in that same parsonage at Haworth, after the children had been tidied away, and the Yorkshire wind rattled the pane, they opened their tin boxes of secret manuscripts and began building worlds. The Brontes were not alone. The sheer number of governesses created a class of literate, angry, ferociously observant women who began pouring their experiences into diaries, letters, and eventually novels. Before Jane Eyre, there was a genre of advice manuals and tales of the governess in women's periodicals, always warning of the dangers of this limbo existence and instructing governesses how to behave. But then, in 1847, the bomb went off. Under the pseudonym Currer Bell, Charlotte Bronte published Jane Eyre, the story of a governess who speaks, who falls in love with her employer, who demands to be seen as his equal, who walks away rather than compromise her integrity, and who ultimately returns only on her own terms. It was a grenade lobbed directly into the Victorian drawing room. The critics were scandalized. The public devoured it, and suddenly, the invisible woman in the grey dress was the most talked about figure in England. But the uprising was not purely literary. Meanwhile, quietly, something else was happening that would begin to change the material reality for these women. In 1841, a group of alarmed philanthropists, mainly women, had founded the Governesses' Benevolent Institution on Harley Street. It was not yet a union, not yet a political force, but it was a spark. For the first time, governesses could register at a free employment office without paying extortionate agency fees. For the first time, they had access to a savings bank. And for the first time, the plight of the elderly, destitute governess was made visible to the public through annual reports and charity appeals. The institution began gathering stories, statistics, and horror cases. Elderly women found starving in attics, women who had taught earls' daughters and died in workhouses. And those reports, those dry documents, were being read by exactly the kind of women who would become activists and writers. The two streams, literature and reform, were starting to flow together, and a generation of women who had been taught to be silent was about to find its voice. But here is the cliff edge. Before Jane Eyre could change a single life, Before the GBI could save a single governess from the poorhouse, before the Bronte sisters became literary immortals, these women had to endure. They had to learn the exact temperature of humiliation, the precise weight of a cold dinner tray, the particular way a mistress could destroy you with a single glance. The daily indignities were not the prelude to the story. They were the story. And none of it, not the literature, not the reform, not the slow march toward independence, would have happened without them. The governess was a bomb made of loneliness, and the fuse had been lit. But before it could go off, there was a great deal of suffering still to be witnessed, hour by agonizing hour. So, let's step deeper into the house. The morning bell has just rung. The children are filing in, and your real education is about to begin. The morning bell rings at 6:30. You are already dressed, already cold, already arranging the slate pencils in a neat row, because you have learned that neatness is the only kind of control you will ever have in this house. The children arrive. The boy is 8 and already knows he will be leaving you for school next term, so he treats you like furniture. The girl is 10, bright-eyed, still capable of loving you, which means her mother is already watching for signs of excessive attachment. You open the spelling primer and begin the day's first lesson, and you do not stop moving, talking, correcting, praising, and pretending until 8 o'clock at night. This is the rhythm of the governess's life, 17 hours of duty, broken only by meals you eat alone. And this rhythm, this grinding, isolating, dignity-eroding rhythm, was not an accident. It was the entire point. Let's talk about what the daily work actually felt like, because the devil lives in the details. The schoolroom was almost always on the top floor of the house, as far from the family's living quarters as architecture allowed. This was not convenience, it was quarantine. The children's noise was to be contained. The governess's presence was to be minimized. The room itself was a study in contradiction. A globe that showed the world you would never see. A piano you played to make someone else's daughter. Marriageable, a shelf of improving books you had read 6 times because no new ones ever appeared. The fireplace was usually mean, a small grate that ate coal without giving heat, because the family did not believe in wasting fuel on the nursery. You taught in your coat. You wrote with fingers so cold the chalk snapped. There are letters from governesses describing chilblains so severe they could not hold a pen, and mistresses who refused to provide an extra scuttle of coal because the children don't seem to mind the cold. The children themselves were a lottery. You might get a quiet, studious girl who reminded you of yourself at that age, and you would pour everything into her. Extra reading, secret poetry, careful conversations about character and truth. But you knew you were building on sand. The moment she came out, the formal entry into society at 17 or 18, she would be taken from you, and you would be expected to forget her. If you cried at the parting, you were unprofessional. If you wrote to her afterward, you were presumptuous. One governess described watching her former pupil pass in a carriage 2 years after leaving service and receiving nothing but a blank stare, as if the woman had been taught to wipe her memory clean. The governess wrote, "I had taught her to read Shakespeare. Now I was less than a street sweeper." But you might also get a monstrous child, a boy who kicked and bit and knew that the governess had no real authority, a girl who had already learned from her mother that the governess was a lower form of life and could be treated accordingly. Louisa May Alcott, before she wrote Little Women, worked as a governess and described a child who threw a tantrum so violent that Alcott had to lock herself in a closet to avoid being struck. The mother's response was not sympathy for the governess, but annoyance that the child had been upset. The governess was always in the wrong. If the child was lazy, the governess had failed to inspire. If the child was wild, the governess had failed to discipline. If the child was unhappy, the governess had been too harsh. The contract was unwinnable as written. Mealtimes were the daily ritual of humiliation. The governess did not eat with the family. That was unthinkable. She might, in the most liberal households, be permitted to take dinner with the children, but more often she ate alone after the children had been fed. Her food was whatever the kitchen could spare, which meant the least desirable portions, often cold, often late. The tray arrived in the schoolroom with a thud. The meat was gristly, the vegetables boiled to gray, the pudding a stodgy lump. There are accounts of governesses being sent the same meal for days on end because the cook could not be bothered to vary it. One woman reported that she was given bread and cheese for supper every night for 3 years. She wrote, "I began to dread the sound of the gong, not for what it meant to others, but for what it meant to me. Another tray, another hour of silence, another evening of staring at the wall." But the real indignity was not the quality of the food, it was the isolation it enforced. While the family dined and talked and laughed in the dining room, the governess sat alone with her plate on her lap, listening to the muffled sounds of a life she was not permitted to join. She could hear the clink of glasses, the rise and fall of conversation, the occasional burst of music if someone played the piano after dinner. She was close enough to hear, but far enough to know she would never be included. If she felt lonely, she could read. If she felt bitter, she could write in her diary. If she felt desperate, she could stare out the window at the dark lawn and wonder how many more years of this her soul could take. The staircase was the great metaphor of the governess's existence. She was always on it, always between floors, never belonging anywhere. She went up to the nursery and down to the kitchen only when summoned. If she passed a servant on the stairs, the servant might acknowledge her with a curt nod, or might not. The servants resented her presence because it complicated the hierarchy. She was not one of them. She ate too well, spoke too well, dressed too well, even in her gray uniform. But she was not one of the family either. She was a living reminder of the instability of class, a gentlewoman reduced to work, and the servants, who had never been gentle in the first place, sometimes took a vicious pleasure in reminding her of her fall. Footmen would not open doors for her. Housemaids would forget to lay the schoolroom fire. The cook would time her meals to be cold on purpose. The governess could not complain without sounding like a snob. She could not endure without burning inside. Then there was the mistress. The lady of the house was, in theory, the governess's ally, the two of them united in the project of raising accomplished daughters. In practice, she was often the greatest source of misery. The Victorian mistress was an anxious creature. Her entire social standing depended on the conduct of her household, and the governess was a loose variable. Was the governess too young, too pretty, too well educated? Did she speak to the master with too much familiarity? Did the children love her more than they loved their own mother? The questions ate at the mistress like acid. She would appear in the schoolroom at odd hours, checking. She would listen behind doors. She would quiz the children after lessons. What did Miss Smith say to you today? Did she speak of any improper subjects? Did she mention your father? The governess learned to fear the sound of the mistress's footsteps, and if the mistress decided you were a threat, your position was over. You would be called to the morning room and told, in icy, impeccable politeness, that your services were no longer required. No reason would be given. No reference would be written. You would pack your carpet-bag and be gone by the afternoon. Without a reference, you could not get another position. You would join the thousands of governesses haunting the registry offices, hoping for a miracle, while your savings evaporated. The threat was always there, unspoken, hanging in the cold schoolroom air like frost. But here is where the story takes a strange and fascinating turn, because the very machinery that was designed to crush the governess was also producing the conditions for her rebellion. It was not organized, not yet. It was not political. It was more like a slow chemical reaction happening in 1,000 cold schoolrooms across England. Governesses were reading, they were thinking, and they were writing. The conduct books told them to avoid novels because novels were exciting and might give them ideas. So governesses read novels in secret. The books warned against poetry because poetry inflamed the passions. So governesses wrote poetry in secret. The manual said to keep a diary but to show it to the mistress on request. So governesses kept 2 diaries. The decoy, filled with bland observations about the weather and the children's progress, and the real one, hidden inside a sewing box or under a floorboard, filled with fury and longing and razor-sharp observations of the family upstairs. The most striking thing about these secret writings is their clarity. Governesses were the invisible witnesses of upper-class life. They saw how the ladies spoke to the footmen when no guests were present. They saw how the gentleman drank whiskey in his study and wept. They saw the cruelty, the hypocrisy, the desperate performance of respectability. And because they were alone so much, they had time to process what they had seen. They had time to think. This was the great unintended gift of the governess system. It took intelligent, educated women and gave them nothing to do in the evenings but think and write. It was a pressure cooker for consciousness. Anne Bronte's novel Agnes Grey, published in 1847, the same year as Jane Eyre, is the purest distillation of the governess experience. It is less Gothic, less passionate than her sister's work, but in some ways it is more devastating because it is so precise. Agnes describes arriving at her first post and being given a room that is small but comfortable. She describes the children, one a violent boy who tortures birds, the other a cold, fashion-obsessed girl with a detail that can only come from lived experience. She describes the parents who do nothing, who see nothing, who care nothing. The novel is a slow burn, accumulating the small daily humiliations until the reader feels suffocated. And when Agnes finally leaves her post, there is no explosion, no revenge, just the quiet exit of a woman who has been treated like a shadow and has decided, finally, to step into the light. But Anne Bronte did not live long enough to see her influence. She died of tuberculosis in 1849 at the age of 29. Emily Bronte, who had also been a governess and loathed it with a passion that boiled over into wuthering heights, died the year before, also at 30. Charlotte outlived them both, but only by a few years. She died in 1855, at 38, pregnant with her first child. The 3 sisters who had done more than anyone to expose the governess's life were all dead before the age of 40. The work, the cold, the isolation, the damp Yorkshire air, it had all taken its toll. But their books lived on, and they had planted a seed. Jane Eyre, in particular, was a bombshell. It was not just a novel about a governess. It was a novel about a governess who refuses to be invisible. Jane speaks. She demands to be heard. She tells Mr. Rochester, her employer, the man she loves, "Do you think, because I am poor, obscure, plain, and little, I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart." This was the line that exploded in Victorian drawing rooms. It was a declaration of equality from a woman who, in the real world, was required to be silent. Readers understood that this was not just fiction. It was a manifesto, and its author was a former governess who had been paid £20 a year and had been forced to eat alone in a cold room. The publication of Jane Eyre in 1847 was the pivot point. Before, the governess was a figure of pity or contempt. After, she was a figure of power. The novel made governesses visible. It made their inner lives, their desires, their angers, their passions, impossible to ignore. And it emboldened other women. If Charlotte Bronte could write it, why couldn't they? The floodgates began to open. Governess novels, governess memoirs, governess essays began pouring into the literary marketplace. Not all of them were as good as Jane Eyre, but they all added to the growing sense that something was wrong with the system, that the way these women were treated was not just unfortunate, but unjust. Meanwhile, the governess's benevolent institution had been quietly working since 1841 on the material side of the problem. Let's talk about what the GBI actually did, because it was more radical than it sounds. The institution's free registry was the first practical assault on the exploitation of governesses. Before the GBI, a woman looking for a post had to go through a commercial agency that charged fees she could not afford. These agencies were unregulated, sometimes corrupt, often colluding with employers to drive down wages. The GBI registry was free. It was transparent. It required references, which meant employers could check backgrounds, but it also tracked which employers had a reputation for mistreatment. For the first time, governesses could compare notes and share information. It was the beginning of a proto-union, dressed in the language of charity. The GBI also established a savings bank. This was crucial. Governesses earned so little that they could not accumulate capital. One illness, one period of unemployment, and they were destitute. The savings bank allowed them to deposit tiny sums, a shilling here, a sixpence there, and earn modest interest. Over time, these saving accounts became a lifeline. Women approached retirement with something rather than nothing. And for those who did not save enough, which was most of them, the GBI ran a small pension fund. The pensions were not generous. They were survival money at best. But they kept women out of the workhouse. They kept women alive. Then there was the GBI's most radical project, the Queen's College, opened in 1848 on Harley Street, directly above the GBI offices. Queen's College was the first institution in England to offer higher education to women. It began as a series of lectures, literature, mathematics, natural philosophy, theology, taught by university men to a room full of governesses and would-be governesses. The idea was that if governesses were better educated, they could command better wages. But the effect was far larger. The women who attended Queen's College were not just learning facts, they were learning that they deserved to learn. They were forming friendships. They were exchanging ideas. They were becoming a community. And from that community came teachers, educational reformers, and political activists who would lead the next generation's fight for women's access to universities, professions, and the vote. Queen's College was the governess's revenge made flesh. Now, let's pull back to the individual scale, because the power of this story lies in the single life, in the particular. Think of a woman we will call Miss W, as the GBI reports often did. In 1845, Miss W is 34. She has been a governess for 16 years. She has worked in 4 households, all respectable, all miserable. She has saved nothing because her salary went to support a widowed mother and a younger brother who never worked. She is tired. She has a cough that will not go away. She writes to the GBI asking for help finding one more post, one last position before she collapses. The GBI places her with a family in Surrey. She lasts 2 years. Then the mistress discovers her writing in her private diary, not about the family, just her own thoughts. But the mistress is enraged by the principle of a governess having private thoughts. Miss W is dismissed without reference. She returns to London and disappears into the mass of unemployed gentlewomen, living in a rented room in Bloomsbury, eating 1 meal a day, waiting. She dies of tuberculosis in 1849, in the same month and year as Anne Bronte. But nobody writes a novel about her. Multiply Miss W by thousands. Now you have the reality. Now you see why the Bronte novels hit like a thunderclap. They were not stories about governesses. They were the truth that governesses had been living, finally spoken aloud. And the culture was not ready for it. The critics attacked. The conservative press warned that Jane Eyre was coarse, unfeminine, dangerous to the morality of young women. An 1848 review in the Quarterly Review called it preeminently an anti-Christian composition because it suggested that a woman might have a soul equal to a man's and might demand to be recognized as such. The reviewer wrote, in a line that now reads as a badge of honor, "We do not hesitate to say that the tone of mind and thought, which has overthrown authority and violated every code human and divine abroad, and fostered Chartism and rebellion at home, is the same which has also written Jane Eyre." Translation: this novel is an act of revolution, and the readers did not care. They devoured it. Jane Eyre went through edition after edition. It was translated, pirated, serialized, discussed at dinner tables, quoted from pulpits. Thackeray wept over it. Queen Victoria read it in private and recommended it to her daughter. The novel had done something extraordinary. It had taken the most pitiable, most invisible figure in the Victorian social order and made her a hero. And in doing so, it had given every governess in England permission to imagine herself differently, not as a victim, but as a protagonist. This was the moment the governess began to rise, not as a political movement that would take another generation, but as a cultural force. The women who had been told to be silent were finding their voices. The women who had been told to accept their lot were beginning to ask questions. The women who had been eating cold dinners alone in the nursery were picking up pens. And the system, that vast, smug, crushing system of class and gender and property, had no idea what was coming. But the governesses knew. They had always known. They had been watching from the upstairs window, and they had seen everything. Now they were about to tell, but telling was not simple. It was not safe. And for every woman who found her voice, there were a dozen who discovered that speaking up was the fastest way to be destroyed. The governess's world was a world without witnesses. If something happened in the nursery at midnight, or in the library when the children were elsewhere, or in the corridor when the house was asleep, who would believe her? The master was a gentleman. His word was law. Hers was nothing. This was the shadow that fell across every governess's life, the thing the conduct books never mentioned, the thing the novels hinted at only in code. And it is the darkest part of this story, the part we cannot skip, if we are to understand what these women endured and what they eventually overcame. The Victorian governess occupied a position of ghastly vulnerability. She was an unmarried woman living inside a strange man's house, entirely dependent on his goodwill for her survival. There was no human resources department, no complaint mechanism, no sympathetic constable to appeal to. The household was a private kingdom, and the master's authority was absolute. On paper, the governess was under the protection of the mistress. In practice, the mistress might be an ally, or she might be an enemy, or she might simply be exhausted and indifferent, and the master might be a decent man, or he might not. The governess could not know until she was inside the house, and by then it was too late to escape. The stories that survive are fragmentary, coded in euphemism and ellipsis, but they are unmistakable once you learn to read them. A governess in a wealthy household wrote to a friend describing attentions that should not be borne from the eldest son, a university boy, who had returned for the holidays. She told the mistress. The mistress accused her of encouraging him. She was dismissed. She wrote, "I have no reference. I have no character. I am 26 years old, and my life is over." Another governess, placed in a grand house in Scotland, was cornered by the master while the mistress was visiting relatives. She fought him off. He told his wife that she had made improper advances toward him. She was turned out into the snow with 1 month's wages and a reputation in tatters. She walked to the nearest town and took a room in an inn, where she tried to find work as a seamstress. The needlework was not enough. Within 2 years, she was dead of consumption, her lungs eaten by the same cold that had never left her since that night. These stories were not rare. They were endemic. The GBI's confidential files, what little of them survive, contain case after case of governesses who had been ruined, compromised, forced to leave under circumstances too painful to relate. The institution's founders knew exactly what was happening, but they could not speak of it publicly without risking their own respectability. So they wrote around it. Their annual reports mention moral dangers, peculiar trials, temptations to which the unprotected female is exposed. The code was transparent to anyone who wanted to understand. The governess was a sitting target, and the arrows were flying from every direction. Even when the master was not a predator, the governess was still a magnet for suspicion. The mere presence of a young, unmarried woman in the house was enough to destabilize a marriage. The mistress watched her. The servants gossiped. The neighbors speculated. Every conversation between the governess and the master was parsed for hidden meaning. Did she laugh too readily at his jokes? Did she linger too long in the room where he was reading his newspaper? Did the children report that Miss Smith had spoken of their father with a particular warmth? These questions might seem absurd to us, but they were deadly serious at the time. A whisper could destroy a governess's career, and whispers were cheap. In 1849, a scandal broke that demonstrated exactly how precarious the governess's position was. A young woman named Lucy, her full name was never made public, was employed in the household of a prominent London barrister. She was 23, educated at a respectable ladies' seminary, the daughter of a deceased naval officer. The barrister's wife became convinced that Lucy was attempting to seduce her husband. There was no evidence, no improper letter, no witnessed encounter, just the wife's conviction, fed by the servants' gossip and the husband's vague habit of being distracted. Lucy was dismissed instantly. The wife saw to it that the story spread through her social network, embellished with enough detail to make it indelible. Lucy applied to 18 agencies. 18 times. The agency head shook his head. Her name was known. Her reputation was ruined. She appealed to the GBI. They tried to help, but even the GBI could not place a governess with a cloud over her character. Lucy eventually took a position as a maid-of-all-work in a tradesman's family, scrubbing floors for 6 pence a day. Her French and her watercolors forgotten. She was still a servant, but now she was a servant who could not even pretend to be a lady. She wrote to the GBI, "I have descended to the bottom of the ladder, and the bottom is as cold as the top." This, then, was the unspoken reality beneath the literary triumph of Jane Eyre. The novel had made the governess visible, but visibility was a double-edged sword. The public now knew that governesses existed, that they had inner lives, that they could fall in love and demand respect. That was progress. But the public also now associated governesses with passion, with ambition, with the dangerous idea that a woman might want more than her station. This made mistresses more suspicious. It made masters more curious. It made the governess more of a threat and more of a target. In the short term, the success of Jane Eyre may actually have made life harder for the women it was meant to represent. The backlash was fierce. The conservative press did not merely attack Jane Eyre, they attacked the very idea of the governess as heroine. An article in the ladies' newspaper in 1848 warned that governesses who read such novels would be filled with vain and presumptuous thoughts, imagining themselves the heroines of unwritten romances and forgetting their proper place. The phrase "their proper place" appeared over and over, a dog whistle that everyone understood. The governess was supposed to be invisible. Jane Eyre had made her visible. This was a violation of the natural order, and the natural order would push back. And push back it did. The 1850 saw a wave of counter-novels, books that depicted governesses as scheming, immoral, ambitious, and untrustworthy. In these novels, the governess was always trying to seduce the master, steal the family silver, or corrupt the children with her French novels and her fancy ideas. The stereotype of the scheming governess entered the culture and never left it, feeding back into the suspicion that already plagued real women in the profession. Every time a mistress hesitated to hire a pretty candidate, every time a servant whispered about Miss So-and-so's airs, Every time a father looked a little too long at the young woman in the gray dress, the stereotype was reinforced. The governess was caught in a cultural trap. The novels that gave her a voice also gave her enemies a script. Meanwhile, the material conditions were barely improving. The GBI was doing heroic work, but it was a tiny institution with a tiny budget. In 1850, it had helped a few hundred governesses. There were still 25,000 in the census, and thousands more working under other labels. The free registry was overwhelmed. The savings bank was underfunded. The pensions were a drop in an ocean of need. Queen's College was a beacon, but it could only take a few dozen students at a time. Most governesses never heard of it. Most continued to live in cold schoolrooms, eating cold food, hiding their diaries, and hoping the mistress would not take offense at the way they held their teacup. The GBI's annual reports from the 1,850s make for grim reading. They are filled with letters from governesses begging for help. A woman in her 40s who had spent 23 years in service and had saved nothing because her wages went to support her elderly parents. A woman in her 60s, once governess to the children of a duke, now living in a single rented room with no fire and no food, too proud to go to the workhouse, but too hungry to survive much longer. A young woman who had been dismissed for refusing the master's advances and was now without character, without friends, without hope. The GBI could offer small assistance, a pound here, a blanket there, a recommendation letter that might open a door. It was not enough. Everyone knew it was not enough. But something was shifting. The accumulation of stories, the aggregation of misery, was beginning to create a different kind of pressure. The governess question had become a public debate. Newspapers ran editorials about it. Parliament was petitioned. Charles Dickens, who had a sharp nose for social injustice, wrote about governesses in his magazine Household Words, calling attention to the lamentable condition of a class of women who are expected to be gentle and refined, yet who are paid less than a butler and treated worse than a scullery maid. The comparison was deliberate and devastating. A butler could save money, could marry, could rise. A governess could do none of those things. She was trapped in her gentility, a victim of her own education. This was the paradox at the heart of the governess problem. The very qualities that made a woman employable as a governess, refinement, education, moral sensibility, also made her unemployable for anything else. She could not go back. She could not go forward. She could only hover in the limbo between upstairs and downstairs, waiting for a marriage that would probably never come, for a pension that did not exist, for a death that was often a relief. And yet, in the midst of this grinding hopelessness, the governess was writing. The diaries, the letters, the secret novels kept piling up. The Brontes had shown that it was possible. Other women followed. Elizabeth Gaskell had never been a governess herself, but she knew governesses. Her own sister had worked as one, and she wrote about them with fierce empathy. George Eliot, living with a man to whom she was not married and therefore barred from polite society, understood what it meant to be an exile in one's own country, and she wrote governesses into her novels with a complexity that bypassed the stereotypes entirely. The governess was becoming a figure, not just of pity, but of intellectual and moral authority. She had seen things, she knew things, and she was beginning to say them. The 1859 publication of Samuel Smiles's Self-Help, a book that celebrated individual striving and moral improvement, gave the governess a new kind of cultural ammunition. Smiles valorized the self-made man, but women were not supposed to be self-made. Yet governesses were self-made by necessity. They had dragged themselves up by their own bootstraps, educated themselves, supported their families, maintained their dignity in conditions designed to strip them of it. They were, in an odd way, the living embodiment of the Victorian ideal of hard work and moral fortitude. And some of them began to realize it. The governess was not just a victim. She was a survivor. And survivors have power. The 1860s saw the first stirrings of organized resistance. Not yet a trade union, that would have been illegal and unthinkable, but something like a network. The GBI's registry connected governesses to one another. Queen's College connected them to a broader world of ideas and professional women. The feminist movement, still in its infancy, began to notice the governess. Barbara Bodichon, the artist and activist who co-founded Girton College, had been educated by governesses and understood their plight. In 1866, she organized one of the first petitions for women's suffrage, and many of the signatories were former and current governesses. The invisible women were beginning to appear in public, holding pens, signing their names, demanding to be counted. But the real transformation was still one generation away. The daughters taught by governesses in the 1850 and 1860 would grow up to be the first generation of university-educated women, the first generation of female doctors, female journalists, female reformers. They had been taught by women who knew, intimately and bitterly, what it meant to be excluded from the world. And those mothers, for governesses were often mother substitutes, the warmest and most constant presence in a child's life, planted seeds that would bloom decades later. The governess did not march in the streets. She did not throw bricks or chain herself to railings. She taught, she wrote, she endured. And in the end, she was the silent engine of a revolution that changed everything. But before we reach that payoff, we have to sit with the ordinary horror one more time. We have to look at the specific weight of a single evening in a single schoolroom, because the grand historical arc is made of millions of such evenings. The candle has burned low. The children are asleep. The diary is hidden away. The governess sits alone, listening to the distant laughter from below stairs. The servants, who have their own society, their own jokes, their own warmth. Above her, the family sleeps in silk sheets. She is between them, belonging to neither, the sole occupant of a middle floor that exists only in her nightmares. She makes a decision, perhaps not tonight, perhaps not tomorrow night, but soon. She will write. She will find a way out, or she will not. And if she does not, she will become one of the lost names, a number in a census, a letter in a GBI file, a ghost in someone else's attic. The choice is sharp, and it is real, and it is the same choice that every governess faced, night after night, while England slept. Now, let's talk about what happened when they chose to fight. So they fought, not with a manifesto nailed to a church door or a riot in the streets, but with the only weapons they had: ink, patience, and the slow accumulation of evidence. The fight began quietly, in letters to newspapers that were signed "A Governess" or "One Who Knows," because signing your real name was social suicide. But the letters kept coming, and gradually, the reading public began to understand that the governess problem was not a scattered collection of sad anecdotes. It was a structural crisis, a failure of the entire Victorian social contract. The women who had been hired to teach other people's children the virtues of honor and charity were living proof that honor and charity did not extend to women who worked. The turn came slowly, then all at once. In the 1860s and 1870s, the daughters of the governess era began to reach adulthood, and they had been shaped by what their governesses had taught them, not just French and pianoforte, but something deeper. A hunger, a restlessness, a conviction that a woman's life must be more than a waiting room. These daughters went to the newly opened women's colleges, Girton, Newnham, Somerville, institutions that would not have existed without the governess's sacrifice. They became teachers, doctors, journalists, reformers. And when they spoke of their inspiration, they spoke of the quiet woman in the nursery who had refused to let her mind die. Let's trace the thread directly. The governess's benevolent institution, founded in 1841 as a desperate charity, had by the 1880s become something quite different, a nerve center of female professionalism. The GBI's registry had placed tens of thousands of women. Its savings bank had taught an entire generation the discipline of financial independence. Its annuity fund had kept elderly governesses from the workhouse, but more importantly, it had made visible the reality that women could plan for retirement, could save, could control their own futures. These were revolutionary acts dressed in the gray wool of Victorian philanthropy, and Queen's College on Harley Street, that cramped, radical experiment in female education, had a direct line to the suffrage movement. The women who studied there in the 1850s and 1860s included Dorothea Beale, who would go on to transform Cheltenham Ladies' College into a powerhouse of female intellectual ambition. They included Frances Mary Buss, who founded the North London Collegiate School and proved that girls could be educated just as rigorously as boys. They included countless unnamed women who became headmistresses, lecturers, and campaigners. All of them had either been governesses themselves or had been taught by governesses. All of them carried forward the memory of the cold schoolroom and the cold dinner tray, and they built institutions designed to ensure that the next generation would not suffer as they had suffered. The literary transformation was just as profound. After Jane Eyre, the governess novel became an established genre, and it evolved. In the 1860s and 1870s, novels like Charlotte Young's The Clever Woman of the Family and Rhoda Broughton's Cometh Up as a Flower used the governess figure to explore questions of women's independence, sexual morality, and the stifling constraints of middle-class propriety. The governess was no longer merely an object of pity, she was a vehicle for social criticism. And the women writing these novels were increasingly women who had lived the life. The distance between author and subject was collapsing. But the most powerful literary legacy of the governess was not the novels about her. It was the novels by her. The Brontes were only the beginning. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, before she was Elizabeth Barrett Browning, had been educated by governesses and had written poems in secret. George Eliot, though never a governess herself, lived on the margins of respectability and understood the governess's position viscerally. Her novels are filled with sharp, angry women trapped by circumstance, and her own life was a declaration of independence. Harriet Martineau, the great social theorist, had worked as a governess in her youth and had been formed by the humiliation. The list goes on. The governess narrative was not a subgenre of Victorian literature. Victorian literature was, in a deep structural sense, a governess narrative. The woman who had been told to be silent had become the voice of the age. Now, let's step back from the literature and look at the actual women, because the statistics alone tell the story of the long, slow victory. The 1851 census had counted 25,000 governesses. By 1891, that number had dropped sharply, not because the demand for governesses had fallen, but because the alternatives had multiplied. Women who in 1851 would have been forced into the nursery were now working as telegraph operators, clerical workers, nurses, teachers in state schools. The professional landscape had cracked open, and though the cracks were small, they were real. The governess was no longer the only respectable option for a middle-class woman who needed to earn her living. She was one option among many, and that was the definition of progress. The wages had improved, too. A governess in the 1890s could expect to earn between £50 and £150 a year, roughly double what Charlotte Bronte had received. This was still not a fortune, but it was enough to save a little, to buy a few comforts, to plan for a future that was not entirely bleak. The GBI's annuity fund had grown, and new pension schemes were emerging from friendly societies and women's mutual aid organizations. The elderly governess dying in a rented attic was becoming a scandal rather than a norm, something the newspapers reported with outrage rather than resignation. But the deepest transformation was psychological. The governess of the 1890s was not the governess of the 1840s. She was more likely to have a certificate from a recognized training institution. She was more likely to have a network of professional contacts. She was more likely to read magazines and journals addressed specifically to her as a professional woman, not as a figure of pity. The GBI's own publication, The Governess, launched in the 1880s, offered advice, advocacy, and a sense of collective identity. The invisible woman was becoming visible not just in novels, but in the real structures of professional life. And then came the moment that would have made Charlotte Brontë weep. In the final decades of the 19th century, the daughters of those first governesses, the girls who had been taught in cold nurseries by gray-clad women with secret literary ambitions, began to enroll in universities. Oxford and Cambridge opened their gates to women, grudgingly, incompletely, but they opened them. The first generation of female university graduates included a striking number of governesses' daughters and former governesses themselves. They had been taught, all their lives, that education was the only escape. They had been taught this by women who had learned it through suffering. And now they were at the ancient universities, in the libraries and lecture halls, proving that the female mind was not inferior, that it had simply been starved. This was the governess's revenge, and it was total. She had been hired to produce accomplished girls who would make good marriages. Instead, she had produced a generation of women who wanted degrees, careers, and votes. The curriculum she had been forced to teach, the 3 R's, the accomplishments, the ladylike arts, had been a cage. But inside that cage, she had whispered other lessons to her charges. She had slipped in ideas about justice, about independence, about the possibility that a woman might be more than a wife and mother. The mothers might have suspected, but they could not stop it. The books were already read. The questions were already asked. The future was already growing in the nursery. Consider the life of one specific woman, a composite but entirely true to the record. Call her Miss E. Born in 1860, the daughter of a governess and a country solicitor who died young. Her mother taught her Latin and Greek in between lessons for the children of the local gentry. She won a scholarship to a new girls' school, then a place at Girton College, Cambridge. She studied mathematics. She graduated with honors, though Cambridge would not grant her a degree because she was a woman. She became a teacher herself, then a headmistress, then a campaigner for women's education. When she retired in 1925, she looked back at her mother's life and saw the arc, from the nursery to the headmistress's study, from invisibility to authority, from silence to a voice that had been heard by thousands. The governess had not just survived. She had won. The institutional legacy was concrete. By the turn of the century, the GBI had been joined by a host of newer organizations. The Association of Headmistresses, the National Union of Women Workers, the Women's Industrial Council. The language had shifted from distressed gentlewomen to professional women. The understanding had shifted from charity to rights, and the governess, who had been the most isolated figure in Victorian society, had become a symbol of solidarity. The woman who ate alone in the nursery had, in the end, built a table large enough for everyone. Now, here is the unexpected coda. For all the progress, for all the institutional reform and literary triumph and slow march toward equality, the fundamental emotional experience of the governess did not entirely disappear. It transformed. The loneliness, the social ambiguity, the sense of being suspended between worlds, these became the emotional inheritance of the professional woman. The female doctor who was not quite accepted by her male colleagues. The female journalist who was paid less than the men and excluded from their clubs. The female academic who taught brilliantly but was passed over for promotion. They were not in nurseries anymore. They were in hospitals and newsrooms and universities, but the feeling, the particular ache of being present and invisible, necessary and resented, persisted. The governess had escaped the schoolroom, But she had not entirely escaped her condition. And that condition, that limbo, would persist for generations. It persists now in ways we are still beginning to name. But the victory was nonetheless real. The governess had proven something that the Victorian social order had denied, that a woman isolated, underpaid, and disrespected could still change the world. She had done it through sheer accumulation of books read in secret, of letters written by candlelight, of whispered lessons that contradicted the official curriculum, of small acts of solidarity that added up, over decades, to a movement. She had been told she was a failure because she had not married. She had been told she was a threat because she was educated. She had been told she was invisible because she was inconvenient. And she had responded, quietly and completely, by refusing to disappear. The Bronte sisters, dead before 40, never saw the world their books helped create. Miss Bellew, dead of tuberculosis in a rented room, never saw a university open to her daughters. Lucy, who scrubbed floors after her reputation was destroyed by a jealous mistress, never knew that her story would become part of a larger pattern that activists would use to demand legal protection for working women. The thousands of governesses whose names never made it into a novel or a census record or a GBI file, they are the silent majority of this story, and they are the reason it matters. They endured so that others would not have to. They wrote so that others would know, and they did it without thanks, without recognition, without any reasonable hope that their lives would ever be different. But their lives did become different. The governess's life, which began as a social tragedy, became a path to power. The cold schoolroom became a place where resistance was incubated. The cold dinner tray became a reminder that independence was worth the cost. And the silence, the great, oppressive, enforced silence, was broken, finally and forever, by women who had learned that their voices were the one thing that could not be taken from them. That is the story of the Victorian governess. It is not a story of passive suffering. It is a story of active, patient, unstoppable transformation. And it begins and ends in the same room. The nursery at the top of the stairs, where a woman in a gray dress sits alone after the children have gone to bed, picks up her pen and writes the first sentence of a world that does not yet exist. The silence is over. The governess is speaking, and she will not be quiet again. And yet she is quiet again, not silenced, never again silenced, but the kind of quiet that comes after a long fight has been fought, and the outcome is no longer in doubt. The Victorian governess, the woman in the gray dress, eating cold mutton alone, is no longer a living figure. She exists now in census records, in GBI annual reports, on the spines of yellowing novels stacked in second-hand bookshops. Her schoolroom has been converted into a guest bedroom, her globe sold at auction, her letters archived in a library that will keep them at the correct temperature for preservation. She has become history, and history has a way of smoothing away the sharp edges, of making the unbearable seem merely interesting. But if you listen closely, if you read between the lines of those letters and diaries, you can still hear the particular sound of her loneliness. It is not a Victorian sound. It is not bound to 1851 or 1847 or the Bronte parsonage. It is a sound that echoes forward into every room where a woman sits alone, doing work that is necessary and invisible, respected and ignored, essential and unacknowledged. Because the governess did not disappear. She adapted. She morphed into the female teacher, the private tutor, the nanny, the au pair, the adjunct lecturer on a temporary contract, the remote worker staring at a screen while the life of the household hums around her. The conditions have improved immeasurably. Paychecks are larger, protections exist, the law is at least theoretically on her side, but the underlying emotional architecture remains recognizable. The sense of being present, but not quite belonging. The knowledge that your labor is crucial to the functioning of the institution, but that you could be replaced without ceremony. The careful negotiation of proximity to power without ever holding it. These are the governess's inheritances. passed down not through blood, but through work, through the stubborn fact that the world still does not quite know where to place the educated woman who serves. What the governess teaches us, across the century separating her cold schoolroom from our warm screens, is something about the relationship between isolation and creativity, between suffering and voice. The governess wrote, not because she had leisure. Her days were packed from 6:30 in the morning until 9 at night, but because she had solitude. That solitude was enforced, punitive, designed to crush her spirit. But solitude is a tool as well as a punishment. It gives you time to think. It gives you distance from the social performances that eat up so much of life. It gives you, if you are lucky and stubborn, the clarity to see the truth of your situation and the courage to name it. This is why prisons produce great literature. This is why exile produces great art. The governess was an exile in her own country, in her own class, in her own soul, and she wrote her way out. So when we read Jane Eyre today, we are reading a document that is at once a love story, a Gothic mystery, and a labor dispute. Jane refuses to marry a man who would make her his mistress, refuses to stay in a house where she is not seen as an equal, refuses to accept that her poverty and plainness diminish her right to a full human life. That is radical now. It was incendiary then, and it came not from a philosopher in a university, nor from a politician on a platform, but from a woman who had been told, repeatedly, and by people with power over her, that she did not matter. She mattered so much that 175 years later, we are still reading her, still arguing about her, still finding in her story new layers of meaning. The cold mutton was not wasted. The lonely evenings were not empty. They were accumulating molecule by molecule into a substance that could fuel a fire. And here is the quiet, radical thing that the governess did that we rarely talk about. She refused to hate the children. She could have. She had every reason to resent them, these privileged little creatures who would grow up to inherit the world that excluded her, their future weddings, their comfortable marriages, their drawing room conversations about the weather and the servants. All of it would happen without her. She could have taken a cold, mechanical approach to her duties, drilling them in French verbs with the minimum of emotional investment and counting the hours until she could retreat to her diary. Many governesses surely did exactly that. But the ones who changed the world did something different. They loved their charges, not blindly, not sentimentally, but with a fierce, complicated, transformative love that planted seeds. They taught more than the curriculum. They taught that a woman's mind was worth cultivating. They taught that fairness mattered. They taught, by example, that dignity could survive humiliation. And those lessons, once planted, were not so easily uprooted. The daughter of the Victorian aristocrat grew up to send her own daughter to university. The son who had been taught his letters by a governess grew up to vote, eventually, reluctantly, for women's suffrage. The social change that looks, in history books, like a series of political events was also a series of intimate, one-on-one transmissions from governess to child, from invisible woman to future adult. We cannot measure that influence. We cannot graph it. But we can feel its weight when we look at the arc of the 19th century bending, slowly and against immense resistance towards something we now call justice. The governess's benevolent institution still exists, by the way. It changed its name, merged with other charities, evolved with the times, but its core mission, supporting women who have spent their lives educating others, continues. The cold schoolroom is now a metaphor, but the women who need help are still real. Teachers retiring on inadequate pensions, tutors with no savings, women who gave their lives to children not their own and now find themselves alone. The problems are smaller than they were, the numbers less catastrophic, but the thread is unbroken. And the existence of that thread, stretching from 1841 to the present day, is itself a kind of victory. It means that the worst prophecies did not come true. The governess was supposed to disappear into the workhouse or die in a rented attic, her name unrecorded, her life a waste. Instead, she built an institution that outlasted the empire. There is a photograph, taken in the 1890s, of a group of elderly women sitting in a garden. They are former governesses, now residents of a GBI retirement home. Their faces are lined, their hands folded in their laps, their dresses plain and dark. They are not smiling. Victorians rarely smiled for photographs. But they are not defeated. They are present. They are together. They had spent their lives alone in other people's houses, and now, at the end, they have found one another. One of them, we don't know which, wrote in an anonymous letter to the GBI newsletter, "I was invisible for 40 years. Now, I am seen, even if only by my sisters in this garden. It is enough. It is enough. It is enough, and it is not enough, because the governess's story does not end with that garden photograph. It continues in every woman who has ever felt that her work was undervalued, that her education was treated as a threat, that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. It continues in every person who has sat alone in a room, performing a role, keeping the machinery running, while the people who benefit from their labor laugh in another room. The Victorian governess is a historical figure, specific and bounded by her time. But the governess condition is a perennial human experience. And knowing that we are not the first to feel this way, that others have felt it and survived and even triumphed, is one of the few genuine consolations that history can offer. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your blankets and feel the warmth of your own quiet room, consider for a moment what it would have been like to be her, to be educated and ambitious and confined, to be surrounded by people who did not see you, to eat dinner alone night after night while the world went on without you. And then consider what she did with that condition. She did not accept it. She did not surrender to it. She took the only tools she had, her pen, her solitude, her burning sense of injustice, and she built a door where there had been only a wall. And because she built that door, millions of women after her could walk through it. That is not a sad story. That is a story of power. The quiet kind, the patient kind, the kind that does its work in the dark while everyone else is sleeping. If this story found you at the right hour, if it helped you slow your breathing and drift toward a place where history feels close enough to touch, then you already understand why these quiet lives matter. They are the background music of everything we think we know about the past. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, it is worth turning up the volume just a little to hear them more clearly. Take a moment, if you would, to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it tells me that these long, slow dives into forgotten lives are reaching the people who need them. Drop a comment below. I read them, and I always want to know where you are listening from and what hour of the night has found you here. There is something about knowing we are all awake together, spread across time zones and continents, that makes the darkness feel a little less empty. Now close your eyes. The governess has said her piece. The nursery is dark. The last candle is out. And somewhere, in the deep quiet, a pen is scratching across paper, writing the next chapter of a story that is not yet finished. Sleep well.